4 atentados.
I
Yo he
was,
estado.
I was in four terrorist attacks.
Era complicado.
It was very complicated.
Diario en Lima
Every day in
había
Lima, there was
entre
between
5 o
5,
6
6
coche bombas.
car bombs.
Esto es otro mundo.
This is like a new world.
In the year 1990, Peru was beset with issues from all sides. Violence and instability plagued the small South American nation, and the Peruvian government, which was at the time led by center-right President Alan Garcia, was unable to act to effectively solve any of the problems facing the nation. Under the presidency of Garcia, poverty rose dramatically. At the beginning of his presidency, around 42% of Peruvians lived below the poverty line. Yet over the next 5 short years, close to 3 million more Peruvians would fall into poverty, a staggering 13% of the entire country's population at the time. Garcia's poor fiscal and economic policy meant that inflation was running rampant within the economy and would reach into the thousands of percent per year by the time that he left office, rendering even the most basic necessities like food and gasoline completely unaffordable for your average citizen. Most importantly to everyday Peruvians, the paramilitary group called the Communist Party of Peru, or more commonly known as the Shining Path, was wreaking havoc across the country, often perpetrating multiple terrorist attacks per day and waging a full-blown insurgency within the south of Peru. Founded by Abimel Guzman, a professor of philosophy at San Cristobal of Huamanga University, the group would quickly grow and become violent. From their base in the small town of Ayacucho, located south of Lima, the Shining Path would terrorize the people of Peru with the eventual goal of overthrowing the current government and instating a Maoist style of government. Amidst these issues, Alan Garcia was implicated in numerous corruption cases and left the presidency deeply unpopular. The people of Peru would be forced to elect a new leader to help them through these troubling times. The man that they would choose for this role would not only change the course of Peruvian history, he would arguably commit one of the worst genocides the continent has ever seen.
La situación era tan difícil que había que probar con algo nuevo. Entonces él era una alternativa. Entonces no había otra.
Alberto Fujimori was an unlikely man to become the next president of Peru. Born to 2 Buddhist Japanese immigrants, Fujimori had a good childhood by most accounts. His father owned a successful tire business, and for most of his childhood, Fujimori lived a comfortable life, far from the everyman struggle that he would later portray. Fujimori would go on to get degrees in agricultural science, physics, and mathematics, graduating not only from Peru's top school of agricultural science, but also studying abroad in both France and the United States, at the universities of Strasbourg and Wisconsin-Milwaukee. After completing college, Fujimori would have great success, being appointed dean and then later rector of the National Agrarian University, the college where he got his degree in agricultural sciences. He would even briefly host a TV show on national television called Concertando, but this did not lead to a long media career. In 1990, his life would take a drastic turn when he decided to get into politics. Running as an outsider candidate for the right-wing party, Cambio 19, Fujimori campaigned on a platform that appealed to the working-class people of Peru. He promised economic reforms that would fix the economy while avoiding the pains of a recession, as well as promising to be different from the typical politician who had led Peru into the current crisis. At this time, the majority of Peruvian people felt deeply betrayed by the political establishment, and Fujimori capitalized on this, further stoking distrust of the government. While Fujimori may have spent this time portraying himself as a man of the people, his foreign degrees and prestigious job told a very different story. It was also during this campaign that Fujimori picked up a nickname that would stick with him during the entirety of his political career, El Chino. While it directly translates to the Chinese person, it is a common term throughout South America to describe someone of East Asian descent. Fujimori reportedly took well to this nickname, seeing as a term of affection from the people of Peru. This nickname served as yet another means of highlighting his differences from the average Peruvian politician. Fujimori would end up winning the election in 1990. While he slightly underperformed his political opponent, Mario Vargas Llosa, in the first round of the elections, with the alleged support of the United States and the CIA, Fujimori would go on to win a decisive victory in the second round, with over 60% of the votes being cast in his favor. When Fujimori rose to the position of president, the economic state of Peru was dire. The previous government had left the economy in shambles, inflation was at extreme levels across the country, and many Peruvians were left in terrible situations, with little hope. During his presidential campaign, Fujimori's opponent argued for a series of neoliberal reforms and austerity measures that would help bring inflation back under control, but also almost certainly cause a recession. Fujimori planned to capitalize on the Peruvian people's pre-existing fear of neoliberal reforms. He promised to focus on maintaining jobs and stabilizing the economy with minimal recession. These campaign promises that he made explicitly appealed to lower and middle-class voters, and it was precisely this kind of voter that would ultimately help Fujimori to secure the win in his first presidential election. Almost as soon as he was elected, however, Fujimori would abandon these campaign promises and institute extreme neoliberal reforms in order to fix the Peruvian economy and bring inflation back down to reasonable levels. Almost immediately after coming into office, Fujimori would implement a series of economic reforms known as Fuji Shock. This meant removing subsidies and price controls on a series of essential goods, along with other measures. This would be devastating for Peru's poorest. Over the coming days, prices of rice would rise over 500%, prices of gasoline over 3,000%, and prices of cooking fuel would rise over 6,000%. Fujimori knew this would be an extremely controversial measure, and so before he announced this, he would deploy the military across Lima. Within 2 weeks of being elected, he had sent the military into the streets of his capital city. Perhaps this was foreshadowing for the rest of his tenure as president. For the next several months and years, Fujimori would continue to expand on the neoliberal reforms that he began in the earliest days of his presidency. He would implement many of the ideas that his former running mate had suggested, including market liberalization, a reduction on tariffs, reducing the number of people employed by the government, and privatizing many of Peru's state-owned businesses, all of which he had campaigned against while running for office. While the economic policies that Fujimori put in place was a betrayal of the promises that he explicitly made to voters during his campaign, these actions were not as disastrous for the Peruvian economy as he claimed they would be before he was elected. Once in office, Fujimori chose to trade the long-term stability of the Peruvian economy for the short-term pain of rising prices. Looking back at the economic policies of Fujimori, many Peruvians explained that they thought it was a necessary step for Peru to transition to becoming one of the most stable economies in the region. However, a stable economy would not be the only legacy that Fujimori would leave behind in Peru. From 1990 to 1992, Alberto Fujimori would work with Congress to pass a number of laws. However, he was hamstrung on some of his most important neoliberal reforms, which he believed would be essential to fixing the country's economy. He would clash with Congress on these issues, until 1992, when he chose to take action. On April 5, 1992, Fujimori would go on national television within Peru to announce that he was dissolving the Congress. He then ordered the military to drive a tank onto the steps of Congress to shut it down. The military would then proceed to tear gas the congressmen who attempted to hold a session, and generally prevent anyone from forming a coherent response to Fujimori's coup. That same night, Fujimori would send the military to arrest his political opponents in a blatant attempt to consolidate his power and stamp out any dissenting voices. Fujimori would even attempt to have former President Alan Garcia arrested, but Garcia would escape and seek refuge abroad. Following this coup, Fujimori would dissolve the Congress and give himself the power to run a temporary government and draft a new constitution for Peru. Fujimori would set out to radically alter the constitution of Peru and fundamentally change the balance of power within the country. Under the new constitution, the Congress's size and power was reduced. The president not only kept his veto powers, but they were expanded, and the judicial branch would lose a lot of its independence. Under this new constitution, the president would also be allowed to make decrees as long as he informed the Congress about it, and he was allowed to dissolve the Congress at any time and rule until new elections were held. Most importantly, the new constitution that Fujimori wrote granted him the power to be re-elected to the position of president, a power he would later use to run for a second term. Finally, under the new constitution, Fujimori granted himself the right to take more extreme measures to crack down on terrorism and to enact harsher punishments on terrorists. He could now impose curfews and had the ability to violate the rights of the people for the sake of rooting out terrorism. Fujimori would soon use these new powers to their full effect. There was initially some international outrage at this blatant power grab by Fujimori, and the United States would temporarily halt its aid for Peru. However, just 2 short weeks later, the White House, under George H.W. Bush, would cave and once again agree to recognize Fujimori and his government as the legitimate leaders of Peru. This was partially due to fears of the Shining Path taking control of the country and plunging it into chaos if Fujimori was removed from office, and partially due to the United States' insistence on having Peru as a vital ally in combating drug smuggling within South America. Regardless of the reasons, it is clear that the Bush administration chose America's interests in the region over the well-being of the Peruvian people. In one swift move, Fujimori had rigged the government to give him more power than any of his predecessors had ever had, and he would go on to use it to radically reform the country. To this day, the 1993 constitution that was written by Fujimori after his illegal dissolution of the Peruvian Congress is the constitution used by Peru, and it would serve as one of the most enduring symbols of Fujimori's legacy on the country. One of Fujimori's first priorities after becoming president was to crack down on the group of guerrilla fighters known as the Shining Path. He spent his entire presidential campaign promising to be tough on the rebels that plagued the south of Peru, and almost as soon as he came to power, Fujimori would make good on this promise by enacting a wide-sweeping and repressive campaign of violence on the rebel-controlled areas. The Shining Path was an insurgent organization that used violence and terror to get what it wanted. The most notable attack by the Shining Path was the Torada Street bombing in Lima, where members of the group blew up a truck containing close to 500 kilograms of explosives outside the Credit Bank of Peru. 25 innocent civilians were killed, and 250 were wounded in this devastating attack. The attack was met with widespread international condemnation, and even the Shining Path would later go on to apologize for the bombing. Despite the deplorable actions of the Shining Path, the government under Fujimori acted no better. In his crusade against the Shining Path, Fujimori would routinely have people kidnapped, tortured, and murdered for even being suspected of being associated with the rebel group. The government would routinely destroy villages that were accused of hiding the Shining Path, and massacres were not uncommon in this era. The National Intelligence Service of Peru, also known as the SIN, were notoriously brutal. Led by Fujimori's longtime supporter, Vladimiro Montesinos, who was allegedly a spy for the CIA throughout his life, and whose friendship was one of the reasons for America's support for Fujimori in his original campaign, the SIN committed numerous atrocities for Fujimori, and would act as his personal secret police throughout the entirety of his time as president. The SIN would also routinely murder people with no evidence of guilt, taking them to the notorious sub-basements under their headquarters, where they would be tortured and executed before their bodies would be burned to hide any evidence. In response to the Torada bombings, the Fujimori government would have 1 professor and 9 students from La Cantuta University dragged forcibly off the campus, tortured, and killed, while most of the victims of Fujimori's government never found justice. He would eventually be found guilty of human rights violations, in part for his role in the La Cantuta massacre. It would take nearly 20 more years for him to be brought to justice. On September 12, 1992, Fujimori would capture Abimael Guzman and several other Shining Path leaders in an apartment complex on the outskirts of Lima. The Shining Path would quickly fracture after this, not being able to survive the power vacuum left behind by the loss of its leader. While the group would still exist in some form or another for the next few years, and even experience a notable resurgence in the early 2000s, the Shining Path would never return to its previous strength. Fujimori would routinely commit atrocities and violate human rights in his crusade to crush the Shining Path. He would eventually succeed and bring relative peace to Peru, but at the cost of many innocent lives. However, those caught in the crossfire in the war between Fujimori and the Shining Path were not the only victims of the government. Many of the other people who suffered to Fujimori would continue to suffer long into his presidency and afterwards. In 1995, as Fujimori was entering into his second term as president, he became increasingly worried about the poverty within the country. Because he was accepting money from the International Monetary Fund, as well as foreign countries, he felt extreme pressure to meet certain statistical guidelines for poverty. One of the poorest groups within the country were the indigenous people of Peru. These people mainly lived outside of Lima and other big cities, and often had an outsized number of children. This was said to contribute to their poverty. Because of that, the fertility rate amongst Peru's poor and indigenous population was of special concern to Fujimori and his foreign supporters. In order to help correct what he saw as a major problem for Peru, Fujimori would reform the pre-existing National Population Program into the new National Program for Reproductive Health and Family Planning. This program had the explicit goal of reducing the fertility rate amongst indigenous Peruvians. Using the rhetoric of helping to alleviate poverty and increase the standards of living amongst the indigenous people, Fujimori was able to get the U.S. Agency for International Development to donate $85 million to Peru between 1994 and 1998. It is important to note that a congressional investigation found there was no evidence of the USAID directly funding this program, but many experts claim that it would have been impossible for USAID workers to not know about it, given their level of cooperation with the Peruvian government. At the very least, the United States government was giving money to a foreign government who was actively engaging in genocide in order to meet the development targets of the United States and other foreign donors. While there were sterilizations before 1995, in the years after 1995, the sterilizations ramped up dramatically. Experts estimate that over 300,000 indigenous Peruvian women were forcefully sterilized as a part of a government program to alleviate poverty. This was a program that the IMF and the United States government must have known about and tacitly supported with their continued donations to Fujimori and his government. Any claim that they did not know about this suggests gross negligence at the very least and willful ignorance of ethnic cleansing at worst. During this time, doctors were forced to meet daily quotas for the number of women they had to sterilize, or they would risk being fired. They often did not even inform the women of the procedure that they were about to do, and often lied to their face about the procedure. In the best cases, doctors would inform the patients and offer some sort of reward to undergo the procedure, although this was rare and still very unethical. The rushed nature of the program meant that doctors were often forced to perform the procedures in very quick succession and give these patients little to no follow-up care, leading to complications for many. The impacts of this program are still being felt in the affected communities today, and the smaller generation of indigenous Peruvians has only exacerbated the economic hardships that they face. Subsequent Peruvian governments have acknowledged the program and how unethical it was, but have attempted to downplay and move on from it with little in the means of compensation for the victims. This program violated not only human rights laws and international treaties, but it also violated the Peruvian constitution at the time. Almost every expert agrees that what Fujimori did with his program was an act of genocide and ethnic cleansing on the indigenous people of Peru, and it will remain as one of the blackest marks on the already tarnished legacy of Alberto Fujimori. As Fujimori's second term was coming to an end, he began planning a way to secure himself a third term as the nation's president. Unfortunately for him, the 1993 constitution that he had written explicitly outlined a two-term limit for the presidency. Fujimori would argue that this term limit did not apply to him because it was enacted whilst he was in office. With the political support of the Congress, he would pass the Authentic Interpretation Law in 1998, which permitted him to run for a third presidential term. Although the law was contested before the election date, in a last attempt to prevent Fujimori from remaining in power, the majority of Congress remained firm in their stance, and Fujimori was forecasted to win the presidency once again. In the election of 2000, Fujimori missed the required number of votes to avoid a runoff election by just 0.4%, while Fujimori was initially projected to win. As the runoff election continued, many irregularities were noticed, and the invalid votes increased from 8.1% to 31.3%. Suspicions of the election being rigged began to be raised, with rumors of corruption sweeping across Peru, and Fujimori finding his political support quickly dissipating. In an attempt to calm his angry constituents, Fujimori would try to appoint a past political opponent, Frederico Salas, to the role of prime minister. This was swiftly rejected by Congress, and only served to increase the suspicions of Fujimori's corruption. The political pressure for Fujimori to nullify the election would increase, and Fujimori was quickly losing political support and allies within the country. Fearing prosecution, Fujimori fled the country to Tokyo, where he would soon fax his official presidential resignation to Congress. Subsequently, Fujimori's running mate in the 2000 election, Alejandro Toledo, would assume the presidency. While he was in exile, the government investigated Fujimori for a number of crimes, including the disappearance of students as well as other actions he took while serving as president. In 2005, Fujimori announced that he would run in the Peruvian election being held next year. He subsequently moved to Chile to begin his campaign, where he was promptly extradited to Peru to stand trial for his crimes. Fujimori would be found guilty of human rights abuses, as well as embezzlement and the bribing of government officials. For all of this, he would be sentenced to 25 years in prison. He wouldn't be released from prison until late 2023, after serving 16 years. He was released on health grounds. Neither Alberto Fujimori nor any government official was ever found guilty for the campaign of mass sterilization that his government inflicted upon the indigenous people of Peru. These actions would fall within the United Nations definition of genocide. Fujimori leaves behind a complicated legacy in the minds of Peruvians. Many people, especially in Lima, claim to remember Fujimori fondly, focusing on the good that he did for the country.
Hay mucha gente que lo respalda porque en su gobierno, en su 10 años de gobierno del 90 al
One man describes the school that Fujimori built in his village, the very first of its kind, as well as the program that he ran to deliver milk to children and pregnant mothers, known as Vaso de Leche.
A los escolares, o sea, todos bajaron y los escolares los hicieron regresar al bus.
Another man, who has been a Lima cab driver for nearly 25 years, describes how he survived 4 separate terrorist attacks at the hands of the rebels, once having to watch a woman be dragged off a bus and shot for just being a police officer. He credits Fujimori with bringing peace and safety back to Lima, as well as fixing the economy. Many of these people now long for the security that Fujimori brought, as well as the sense that he was actually looking out for the people of Peru, however misguided that sense may be. Outside of Lima, though, the reputation of Fujimori quickly becomes more mixed. Many people in Ayacucho, the stronghold for the rebels, remember the deep scars that Fujimori left on the country. One student explains the outrage that he felt when Fujimori was released from jail, claiming that he may have served his time for some of the crimes he committed, but no one was ever punished for the campaign of mass sterilization that Fujimori brought to the indigenous women of Peru. Perhaps Fujimori's most shocking legacy, though, is how quickly he is being forgotten. Many young people in the country know next to nothing about him, his policies, or any of the crimes and atrocities that he committed across the country. Many people in the older generations explained that they were worried the history of the nation would be forgotten. One of the most enduring legacies that Fujimori has left on the nation of Peru is his daughter, Keiko Fujimori. Despite the fact that she has not won any of the last 3 presidential elections that she has participated in, Keiko Fujimori and her party, the Popular Force, remain an incredibly powerful political entity within Peru. Keiko's platform as a politician and her identity within the minds of Peruvians is inextricably linked to her father and his legacy. She continues to push for very similar policies to her father, and spent a large portion of her political career championing for him to be released from jail. Many Peruvians, especially those who were worse affected by the actions of her father, worried that a successful win for Keiko would essentially result in the return of the policies and issues of the 1990s. Despite this, the Peruvian people are once again desperate and looking for a figure to turn to, just as they were in 1990. When asked what the biggest issue facing Peru today is, almost every Peruvian will answer one thing: corruption. From the National Congress, all the way down to local administrators, there is a sense in Peru that corruption plagues every aspect of the government. Many Peruvians feel that there is no one in the government to advocate for them, and that the people in power, ranging from congressmen to judges to prosecutors, are only there to collect their paychecks and steal from the people. The Peruvian Supreme Court is housed in the Palace of Justice, but for many Peruvians, it is more like a palace of injustice. All of this creates a vicious cycle of poverty and dissolution for a lot of Peruvian citizens, with no consequences for those that are benefiting from the corruption. A local man claimed that out of every dollar set aside for welfare to help the people of Peru, only 40 cents would make it to the people who need it most. The rest, he claims, was stolen by the very government officials who were tasked with helping people. Because of this, those who are in dire need of help are all forced to go without any of the support that the government would normally provide. A local official in Ayacucho explains how the people of Peru have almost entirely lost trust and faith in the government. She explains how she and the people she works with try their best to rebuild this trust in the community by providing them with the services that they need, such as water and schooling. But without the support of the central government, they find it incredibly difficult for them to do their jobs effectively. She points to corruption as one of the leading causes of a circle of poverty that has gripped many Peruvians today. Peru once again sits at a crossroads. Inflation may not be at the same levels as it was before Fujimori gained power, and the shining path does not exist in any meaningful way today. Yet there is a pervasive sense amongst Peruvians that the government is as bad as it has ever been, that there is no one looking out for them anymore. Modern-day Peru lives in the shadow of Alberto Fujimori, a man who promised to fight for the people, only to imprison, torture, murder, and sterilize them. A man who lied to their face and seized power for himself. And yet this is a man who many remember fondly, for the security and hope he brought them. A man who they still affectionately call El Chino.